The wind outside the ridges of southern Okinawa carried a sound like the ocean breathing. Slow, low, and mournful. It pressed through the broken limestone, through the mouths of collapsed caves and tunnels, whispering over the bones of those who had already stopped breathing. It was late May, 1945. The rain had not stopped for days, and the island had become a swamp of mud and ghosts. Sergeant James Mitchell moved through it carefully. One step at a time, rifle lowered, breath steady. He was a tall man from Georgia, his skin dark as the volcanic soil beneath his boots, his mind still caught between orders and the quiet rules he carried inside. He joined the Army because it promised equality, a uniform that would make him, finally, the same as any other man. But here, on this island, the uniform did not stop bullets, and it did not erase the looks he sometimes caught even from his own side. He had been told that the caves beneath Maida Ridge were full of Japanese holdouts. Soldiers and civilians mixed together, some armed, some only clinging to the idea that death was cleaner than surrender. The order was simple. Clear every tunnel. Use grenades first if necessary. Mitchell carried 3 on his belt, but the weight that dragged most at his side wasn't his weapon. It was the small flashlight, whose batteries had already begun to die, and the thought of what he might find when the beam finally failed. When he reached the tunnel mouth, the air changed. The scent of burned earth gave way to cold dampness, and the noise of the world disappeared as if swallowed whole. His voice, when he called out, didn't return. No echo, only the dripping of distant water. He ducked low, stepping into blackness that pressed against his helmet like the inside of a mouth. "Anybody down here?" His voice was cautious, almost apologetic. Hands up, no tricks. Nothing, only breath, his own, fogging against stone. He moved deeper, one hand sliding along the wall to keep direction. The floor beneath him was slick with clay, and once his boot struck something soft. A hand. He froze, turned his dying light toward it. A woman's body, thin, wrapped in a shredded kimono. Civilian. Her eyes were open, but they didn't see him. He exhaled slowly. God help us. He pressed on, following a faint draft that hinted at another chamber. The tunnel widened slightly, curving left. Then, a sound. Not movement. A voice. Very faint. A sob. No. Something between humming and praying. It was human. Alive. Mitchell stopped breathing. His hand hovered over the grenade, but he didn't move. The sound came again. A trembling melody. Broken, but familiar. A children's song. He'd heard it before, once in a Georgia church when a missionary woman from Japan had sung a hymn translated into her tongue. He didn't know the words, but the rhythm was the same. Jesus loves me. For a moment, the cave stopped being a cave. It became something else. A hollow in the earth where 2 faiths and 2 fears were about to collide. He crouched, lowering his weapon. "Hey," he whispered, though he knew she wouldn't understand. "You don't have to be afraid." No answer. Then the song faltered and stopped. Silence returned, thick and heavy. Mitchell tried to speak again, but the beam of his flashlight sputtered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. The air felt alive now, breathing around him, pressing close. He could hear her again, but this time it wasn't singing. It was breathing, shallow, trembling, very close. He remembered his grandmother's voice from the South, soft and rhythmic, telling stories of spirits and strangers in the dark, how sometimes, when 2 souls meet without the veil of sight, they can see each other more clearly. Mitchell took off his helmet, set it down gently. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small tin of water, warm from his body heat, and whispered, "Here. Drink." The sound of movement, hesitant, cautious, reached him. a rustle of fabric. Then a hand brushed against his wrist. Small, cold. The contact lasted only a second before pulling back. He didn't move. Instead, he did what came to him without thinking. He began to hum the tune she'd been singing, low and steady, the way his mother had sung to him when the night frightened him as a child. The melody floated through the dark like a bridge made of sound. After a long moment, she answered. The same tune, softer now, trembling like a candle flame. Their voices met in the black, weaving together, not perfect, not even the same language, but enough to tell both that they were no longer alone. When the last note faded, she whispered something. He didn't know the words, but her tone was gentle. She repeated it once more, slower, as if teaching. Shizuko, he thought he heard. He nodded, though she couldn't see. James, he said quietly. Sergeant James Mitchell. It was not a truce. It was not surrender. It was something smaller and infinitely greater. Two people suspended in the dark, without the weight of flags or orders. Hours seemed to pass. Neither spoke again. The war above them raged, artillery echoing faintly through the earth like distant thunder. But down here, the world had reduced itself to breath, to silence, and to the faint echo of a shared hymn. Mitchell didn't know it yet. But this woman, this stranger named Shizuko, would become his compass for what humanity still meant. And she, who had spent weeks believing that every American was a monster, would see her first glimmer of light not through her eyes, but through his voice. In the blackness beneath Okinawa, something unseen had begun, but not victory, not defeat, but the slow unlearning of hate. Shizuko did not speak, not yet. She simply listened, not just to the man in the dark, but to the world that had collapsed above her. For weeks, she had been hiding in the caves, first with neighbors, then with strangers, then with the dying, then, at last, with only the dead. The tunnels had been dug by students and teachers, scraped out by hand when the Americans began shelling the South. Shizuko had been a schoolteacher once, in Naha. She had believed in the empire, in Emperor Hirohito as a living god, in the words of the headmasters who taught that surrender was worse than death. But the children she'd taught had burned in the caves, not by American fire, but by their own army's grenades. She had begged them not to. She had pulled at their sleeves. But when the soldiers handed out the little grenades and vials of cyanide, the mothers obeyed. One by one, silent, dutiful. And so, her classroom became a tomb. Little bodies, bent frames, hands still clutching wooden pencils or crushed rice balls meant for a final meal. And Shizuko, still alive, still breathing, had crawled away into a tunnel that led nowhere. Blind and starved, with only the sound of water and rock and memory to accompany her. When she heard the American voice that day, slow, low, unsure, she had pressed herself flat against the stone. Her fingernails were raw from clawing through collapsed limestone. Her eyes no longer worked in the dark. Her ears had grown sharp. At first, she believed it was death itself, speaking in a foreign tongue. She waited for the shot, the flame, the sound of boots. Instead, she heard humming. It was like a lullaby. Something strange, almost holy, but not of her world. She didn't know the words, but something inside her had recognized the cadence. It was how she used to calm her little brother after a typhoon, or how her grandmother had sung after the loss of a cousin in Manchuria. It was not war. It was not victory. It was mourning. That's why she sang back. Trembling, slow, voice like a ghost. Her lips cracked, her hunger clawing from inside. But the song had come, as if her body remembered something even her mind could not. And then, his voice again. "James," he'd said. She did not understand, so she offered her name, slowly. "Shizuko." She hadn't spoken it aloud in weeks. It sounded strange in her own throat, like saying the name of a forgotten flower. He didn't touch her. Not again. But he stayed. For hours. She could feel the warmth of his presence, like a coal in the dark, neither threatening nor cold. It was the first time in weeks she had not feared the sound of another human being. Shizuko had once believed that American soldiers would defile and destroy. That was what the leaflets said. That was what the instructors said. But the man beside her had done nothing but offer water and a song. His voice was deep, tired, but not cruel. She found herself wondering, why had he not killed her? Why had he not shouted for others? Why was he alone? She leaned her head against the damp stone wall. Her scalp was matted with blood and clay. Her fingernails curled around something soft, a ribbon. Her mother's ribbon. She had tied it to her wrist before the last air raid. "To remember," her mother had whispered. "Even if you lose your name." She had lost everything. But now, in the blackness, someone else had spoken her name back to her. Shizuko, not with contempt, not with triumph, just with acknowledgement. Sergeant James Mitchell sat still. His knees ached, his back throbbed. But he didn't move. He had seen dead women before, in villages, in ruined hospitals. But none had ever sung to him, and none had trusted him in the dark. In training, they said the Japanese would never surrender, that they would pretend to be wounded, then explode themselves, that they would smile and stab you, that women were even more dangerous, willing to kill their own children before capture. But this woman had nothing in her hands but her own silence. No weapon, no scream. Just a melody shared between two shadows beneath a broken island. At some point, James reached into his jacket and pulled out a wrapped biscuit. His rations were nearly gone. But he cracked the biscuit in half and laid one piece gently on the stone beside her. Pressing her hand toward it, she flinched, then paused. Her fingers curled around the food. Slowly, as if uncertain it wouldn't vanish. He felt her hand shake as it brushed his wrist. Then she pulled away, retreating into the dark like a fawn unsure of the wind. She ate in silence, a soft crunch, a swallow, a second breath. When she was done, she made a sound. A word, perhaps, or just a soft sigh. But it was not fear, not anymore. Then, faintly in the silence, she hummed the melody again. James smiled, just barely, and hummed with her. Far above them, the war raged on. Mortars, cries, steel on bone. But here, in the belly of the island, something had begun to change. Not the outcome of the war, not the balance of power, but something deeper. A crack in the wall of everything they had been taught to believe. A song had become a bridge. A song had become a bridge. And across that fragile span, the lies of empire began to crumble. Shizuko sat with her knees drawn tightly to her chest, fingers laced around the ribbon her mother had given her. She had eaten the last of the biscuits slowly, each bite filling her mouth with a taste of disbelief. Not because it was sweet, it wasn't, but because it was offered, given freely, from the hands of the man they had told her would be a demon. She had expected no mercy, no face, no name, only death. Sharp, faceless American death. But instead, in the blind belly of a shattered island, she found James. And his silence, unlike the silence of the dead, was alive with choice. Shizuko had once believed her emperor could hear her prayers. She had written poems of cherry blossoms falling in honor of Yamato. She had sewn bandages for soldiers and taught young girls to march in line. When the war turned toward Okinawa, she volunteered to evacuate the children. When that failed, she dug tunnels with her hands. When that failed, she buried the small bodies herself. And now, she was here, and beside her was an American. A black soldier whose skin in the old days, even in Tokyo, would have brought stares or worse. But he sat quietly, humming, breathing. His breath was warm in the cold. His hands had not harmed her. His voice had not demanded her name. James Mitchell, too, was unraveling the world he had been taught. They told him the Japanese were fanatics, insects in human skin. They said they'd never surrender. They'd slit your throat in a heartbeat, then burn their own children just to spite you. But none of that was true here. Here was a woman who had not attacked, who had not screamed, who had not begged. She had only offered a tune, hesitant, broken, but honest. And James had answered. There was no plan, no guidebook, no rules of engagement for sharing a hymn in the dark with a woman whose brother might have killed your best friend. But it didn't matter, because in the dark, the only war that remained was inside. He leaned his head back against the rock, feeling the roughness dig into his scalp. He hadn't shaved in days. He was down to a half canteen of water and a single chocolate bar. He'd entered the tunnel alone against orders because his gut had told him something was still down here. He hadn't expected her. And now, what could he do? If he left, she would die. If he radioed in, they'd likely throw a grenade down the shaft before asking questions. He had seen it before. Clear the tunnel meant exactly that. But this wasn't a tunnel. Not anymore. It was a confession booth, and every shared breath between them was a surrender that no flag could recognize. They sat together without words for what felt like hours. James dozed briefly, only to jerk awake at the sound of distant artillery. Shizuko flinched at the same moment. Their instincts mirrored each other, the same fear, different uniforms. Then she moved, slowly, carefully. Her hand tapped the stone beside her, feeling her way toward him. When her fingers brushed his sleeve, she froze. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand palm up and let her place her fingers inside it, a gesture that meant nothing on paper. But in that cave, it meant everything. She traced the lines on his palm with one fingertip. His skin was coarse, calloused, but warm. The warmth surprised her. She brought his hand to her forehead and bowed slightly. He didn't understand the custom, but he understood the meaning. It was respect, and in that moment, both of them knew. Whatever this war had demanded of them, this place had become something else. Not surrender, not defeat, not even forgiveness, but humanity. James knew he couldn't stay forever. His squad would notice his absence. But the thought of leaving her here, alone, in darkness, scraped something raw inside him. She had saved no one. She had no medals, no rank, no uniform. Only the silent weight of the dead she had tried to keep warm. And now, because she had trusted a stranger in the dark, she might live. That wasn't strategy. That wasn't military doctrine. That was something older, something deeper. He reached into his jacket again. This time, he pulled out a second item, his dog tags. He slid one tag from the chain and placed it in her palm. She didn't know what it was, but she held it like a relic. Then he said softly, "I'll come back." She didn't understand, but she heard his tone. He pointed to his chest. "James." Then he tapped the metal tag in her hand. "James." Her lips moved. "Jemusu." A soft approximation. He nodded, yes. Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows. She touched her chest. "Shizuko." He repeated it. "Shizuko." And they both smiled, just faintly. Not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. And because it had happened anyway, the tunnel grew quiet again. But this time, the silence was not absence. It was peace. For the first time since the invasion began, James Mitchell felt something deeper than fear or duty. He felt the ground shift. Not beneath his feet, but beneath the truths he had carried in his bones. And above them, the island continued to burn. But beneath the Emperor's silence, two voices had found each other. But beneath the Emperor's silence, two voices had found each other. And above them, unknown to both, the sun had already set. The fourth day of rain rolled over Okinawa like an endless funeral procession. Water sluiced through the collapsed tunnel entrances. Shells fell farther north now, as American forces pressed deeper toward the last holdouts around Mabuni. But the cave where Shizuko and James sheltered was still. Its quiet broken only by the slow trickle of dripping water and the soft rasp of breathing. James shifted his weight. His legs had gone numb. He checked his watch, though in the dark, time meant little. It was after Oro 100. He'd missed roll call. His radio crackled softly in his pack, long since run out of battery. He should have gone back, but he didn't. There was no protocol for this. No rule book. No field manual had trained him for what it meant to share a cave with a starving civilian woman, enemy by uniform but not by action, who had done nothing but accept his song. He couldn't leave her, and he couldn't bring her out. Not yet. To surface meant exposure. It meant shouting to the others, waving her into the open, hoping they didn't mistake her for a threat. It meant her seeing the dead Japanese piled in carts or dumped in trenches. It meant her hearing American soldiers, some kind, others cruel, joke about Japs and geisha girls. She didn't need that. Not now. He looked toward where she sat. Though he could no longer see her, the only proof of her presence was the faint shift of stone when she breathed. And then, her voice again, soft, halting. "Sensei," she said, tapping her chest lightly. "Sensei, watashi." James frowned. He didn't understand. She repeated it, slowly. "Sensei." Then she mimed holding a book, drawing on the cave floor, speaking to invisible children. Teacher. She was a teacher. James let out a slow breath. "You taught children?" She tilted her head at the sound of his voice, catching something in his tone. She nodded. "Kodomo." Children. She made a small, cradling gesture. "Dead," she added quietly. The words sliced through the dark like a blade. James didn't answer. He had no words to comfort her. But in that moment, he saw her not as a civilian or enemy non-combatant. She was a teacher. She had been protecting children. She had failed and lived. And now she carried that failure like a brand across her back. He knew that weight. James had grown up in Georgia, in a town where black men were reminded daily that survival did not mean safety. Where his father had once been whipped by the sheriff for asking to read a newspaper before buying it. Where his older brother had joined the Navy, only to serve in a kitchen while white boys flew planes. He had joined the Army to prove something. Not to them, to himself. But here, underground, with a woman who had no power, no shoes, and no home left, that old fire inside him felt smaller, less righteous. He wasn't here to prove anything now. He was here because this woman, this enemy, had become something else, a human, and now so had he. Shizuko reached slowly toward the stone between them and tapped twice. Then again. A simple rhythm. James smiled faintly. A game. She tapped 3 times. He tapped back 4. She giggled softly. The first time he had heard such a sound. It echoed strangely in the cave, like a child's voice long lost. They played the game for a while. Fingers against stone, tap for tap. It was meaningless, and it meant everything. It was the breaking of rules. Because no nation, not Japan, not America, had trained them to trust one another. They had only been trained to survive. But here, in a place no flag could reach, survival was not enough. They needed something else. They needed each other. James reached once more into his pack. Carefully, slowly, he pulled out the last item he hadn't touched. A folded square of cloth. A handkerchief. White. Clean. He slid it toward her. She picked it up, confused, unfolded it, pressed it to her face, and then, for the first time since the invasion, she began to cry. Silent, shuddering tears. Tears that had waited too long. Tears that belonged to the teacher who'd lost her students. To the woman who had expected rape and received song. To the girl who had once written poems about cherry blossoms and now sat barefoot in the dark, holding a stranger's cloth. James didn't touch her. He only sat close. And that, in the end, was more powerful than any embrace. Because in this war, even proximity was rebellion. Even staying meant treason to hatred. And both of them, in their own silent ways, were guilty. They had broken the rules of war. They had begun to remember how to be human. But war does not rest quietly, even when peace begins to whisper. Outside the cave, dawn crept slowly across Okinawa. A gray, heavy light soaked in rain and smoke. U.S. patrols were moving again. The shelling had shifted south. Sergeant James Mitchell's unit had already reported him missing. Somewhere above, his captain was cursing, a search plan already forming. But below, in the silence of the earth, James was trying to find something much rarer than orders. Trust. It came slowly, like light warming the back of your neck after a long storm. Shizuko had not let go of the handkerchief he'd given her. She had folded it and unfolded it dozens of times, as if memorizing its creases. It was the cleanest thing she'd touched in weeks. It smelled faintly of soap and tobacco. Foreign, yes, but not unwelcome. She pressed it once to her cheek and then, gently, tucked it beneath the ribbon on her wrist. A small act. But to James, it meant more than words. It meant she was holding on, not just to fabric, but to him. He finally spoke. "I have to go," he whispered. She didn't respond at first. Then her hand moved toward his arm, stopping just shy of contact, hovering, as if to ask, "Will you come back?" He nodded in the dark. "I'll find help. I'll bring someone who listens, not just someone who follows rules." But the war had no patience for softness. As he stood to leave, a sound echoed faintly, distant, metallic, rhythmic. Footsteps. Boots. American. He recognized the cadence. Too slow and loose to be Japanese. Then came the sharp voice. "Mitchell, you down here?" James flinched. His body tensed. He moved quickly, crouching beside Shizuko, pressing one finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. She stilled immediately, her breath barely audible. The voice grew closer. "We picked up your signal. Thought you were dead." James shouted back, "I'm here, I'm all right, just slipped off path." A flashlight beam cut through the dark like a blade. The face behind it belonged to Corporal Devers, a wiry white soldier from Mississippi. James stepped forward quickly, blocking the narrow tunnel. "Tunnel's unstable. Nothing worth clearing." Devers frowned. "What the hell are you doing alone, man?" "Scout recon," James replied calmly. "Collapsed section. No enemy. Nothing left." Devers moved forward, angling his light to see past James, but James stood firm. "Seriously," he said, his tone flat. "Nothing down here but ghosts." A pause. Devers seemed to weigh the words. Then he muttered, "Fine, let's get out of here. Cap's furious." As Devers turned back toward the tunnel mouth, James exhaled slowly. Not relief, but something closer to temporary mercy. He turned once more toward the dark recess where Shizuko waited, unseen, and whispered just loud enough, "I'll come back, I promise." Then he was gone, and the dark returned, but not the same. Shizuko sat quietly. She hadn't understood the words, but she had felt the fear. the caution, the danger that came not from her, but from those above. She had almost reached for his sleeve when he turned. Almost asked him, in her broken English, in her teacher's voice, to stay, but she didn't. Because she knew, in the way only those left behind know, that some promises are too fragile to speak aloud. And so she waited. She unwrapped the handkerchief again. Then she reached into the pocket of her tattered blouse and pulled out a crumpled paper scrap. It was a roll sheet, the last one from her classroom. Names, in careful ink, her students. She took the charcoal stub she kept tied into the ribbon around her wrist. And beside the final name, where there had once been blankness, she wrote a new character, Zimasu, James. She didn't know why she wrote it. He was not her student. He had not raised his hand or read aloud. But she had taught him something, and he had taught her something back. That maybe, just maybe, war was not the end of all things. That sometimes, in the most forbidden places, the heart still found room to bloom. Later, when James emerged from the tunnel into the daylight, mud-streaked and hollow-eyed, he didn't report what he'd seen. He gave a short, accurate summary. No threats, no contact, tunnel unsafe, and no one questioned it. Because in a war where everything was broken, silence sometimes held the last pieces of truth. But that night, after mess, after debrief, alone in his tent, James pulled a blanket around his shoulders, turned away from the others, and whispered into the dark, "Hold on, Sensei, just a little longer." Then, without thinking, he reached into his shirt pocket and found the second dog tag, the one he'd left behind, gone. Shizuko had kept it, and he smiled. Because in a place where orders ruled and hearts were broken, someone had chosen to remember his name. 3 days passed. Rain bled into the cracks of Okinawa like ink into paper. The sky remained low, swollen with grief, and the island exhaled the scent of cordite, wet stone, and scorched dreams. Sergeant James Mitchell was not the same man who had crawled out of the tunnel. He followed orders. He cleared structures. He stood in formation. But his eyes were elsewhere. Not on the terrain, nor on the faces of the other soldiers, but somewhere deep beneath his boots. Back in the dark. Back where Shizuko waited. The war machine rolled forward without pause. Marines advanced along the southern cliffs. Civilians emerged in torn clothes from caves, blinking into the sun like ghosts reborn. Some were taken to temporary holding camps. Others were found too late. Women clutching lifeless infants, entire families who had chosen silence over surrender. But James knew one woman had survived, and she was still waiting. He made his plan quietly. 1 extra canteen, 2 biscuits, a chocolate ration saved from mess, a field blanket folded small. He checked the batteries in his spare flashlight. Then he waited until the patrol schedules shifted and slipped away before dawn, beneath fog and the indifference of war. No one noticed. He retraced his steps through the underbrush, mud gripping his boots like the hands of the dead. He passed 2 ruined houses, their bamboo walls collapsed like forgotten prayers. He moved down into the ravine, where limestone gaped open like a wounded mouth. And there, the entrance. The cave had not collapsed. Not yet. But time moved differently underground. He lowered himself in slowly, hands bracing the slick stone. The cold returned instantly. So did the silence. "Shizuko," he whispered. No answer. He moved deeper. Flashlight beam cutting the black into slices of gray. "Shizuko." Then a sound. Soft, hesitant. A tapping. 2 slow knocks on stone. Then 3. He smiled. She was still there. He followed the sound like a heartbeat until the beam caught her. Crouched against the wall, the same ribbon at her wrist, her face thinner now, eyes wide and blinking. She shielded her eyes from the sudden light. James lowered it immediately. "It's me," he said gently. "James." She didn't respond with words. Only motion. She reached into her blouse and pulled something from within. his dog tag, held out like a greeting. He took it, not to reclaim it, but to feel the warmth of her hands on the metal. Then he pressed it gently back into hers. She shook her head. "No," she said in English, soft, deliberate. "Anata, you." James blinked. The word hit him like a bullet made of light. She had remembered, learned, practiced. She had prepared for him to come back. He opened his pack and began laying the things out slowly, gently, like offerings. Food, water, blanket. She stared at them in disbelief. Then she did something he would never forget. She began to laugh, not loud, not mocking, but full-bodied, disbelieving joy. The sound of a woman who had survived against every expectation, including her own. He laughed too, because the sound felt holy in a place like this. Then they sat and ate. And for the first time, spoke in halting phrases. He pointed to himself. "Georgia, America, soldier." She nodded. "Shizuko, Naha, Sensei." They found words that lived between them. Simple ones. Water, children, dead, thank you. When the words failed, they used hands, gestures, songs. At one point, she pulled from behind her a piece of stone with carvings, names scratched into the surface. He couldn't read them, but he understood. Students, lost, but remembered. She pointed to a blank space beneath the names, took his hand, pressed it to the stone. He nodded, and using the charcoal stub she carried like a relic, she wrote his name phonetically, sounding it out. Zie, Musu, James. Side by side with the children she could not save. James swallowed hard. He had come to rescue her. But now he understood. She was saving him from the war that devoured everything, saving him from the story that said enemy meant inhuman. That night, James did not leave. He stayed. They shared the blanket. They slept facing opposite walls, separated by silence, united by something older than language. Trust. A trust born not in victory, not in peace treaties, not in surrender, but in darkness. In the sacred space where rules no longer applied and the soul remembered it was still whole. The next morning, when James finally rose to leave, he paused at the entrance and turned back. He pointed to the rising sun beyond the mouth of the tunnel. Then he pointed to her. She nodded. "Not yet, not today, but soon." And he whispered, "I'll come back. Again, because that's what you say. When someone has given you your name back." When James emerged from the cave that morning, the sky had turned the color of old pewter, a still, expectant gray, like breath held between thunder and silence. He walked with slow steps, not because he was tired, but because the weight he carried now was not on his back. It was in his chest. He had gone into that tunnel twice, and neither time had he returned the same. Back at base, he kept his mouth shut. You learned, as a black man in the army, when not to speak. The wrong sentence could stain a career, or stop it. So he returned to routine. Field reports, mess duty, rifle checks, and the evening radio crackle of Tokyo rose, whispering poison into the night air. But even as his hands moved through the motions of war, James was already planning a third return. Because Shizuko was not a secret, she was a promise. A living soul trapped beneath stone and silence, surviving on more than rations, surviving on the simple hope that someone would come back. And James had decided, if the army would not recognize her, he would. But war leaves little room for mercy. That evening, as he sat at the edge of a field tent, drinking weak coffee and watching clouds roll across the mountains, a jeep rolled up in a spray of red mud. Inside sat Lieutenant Raymond Travers, young, ambitious, white. A West Point man, hair always combed, eyes always scanning for medals. He stepped out, called James over. "You're Mitchell, right? Georgia boy, 37th Division." James stood. "Yes, sir." "We're moving sectors. South Ridge. Intel says there's another tunnel complex, possible holdouts." I want you on recon." James nodded, hiding the churn in his stomach. "South Ridge." That was her ridge. He forced his voice steady. "Sir, I was just assigned the northern push." "You were reassigned." Travers offered a cold smile. "Congratulations." There was no use protesting. Orders were orders. But something in the lieutenant's tone, precise, clipped, told James this was no coincidence. Someone had seen him. Someone had followed. And someone had reported. Later that night, under cover of a dying moon, James slipped away again, not in uniform, not armed, just him, a blanket, and a small metal tin of tea stolen from the officers' mess. A peace offering. A goodbye, if it came to that. The cave mouth greeted him like an old friend. He descended quickly, every curve memorized now, the slope of each stone etched in his boots. "Shizuko," he called gently. No answer. He stepped deeper. "It's me, James." Then, the sound. Not a voice, but fabric moving. Then a sharp intake of breath. He turned the light and found her crouched, eyes wide, mouth open in surprise, not fear, relief. She rushed forward before she could stop herself. Only a few steps. Then paused, remembering the line between cultures, between grief and joy. But James stepped forward just enough and handed her the tin. "Tea," he said, "for you." She opened it carefully, inhaled the scent, and her eyes welled with tears. Not for the tea, but for what it meant. He sat beside her again. They shared silence. Then, slow words. She tried English, he tried Japanese. The meanings blurred, but the meanings were never the point. The music of presence. That was the real conversation. Shizuko told him, in fragments, about her father, a fisherman, about her students, some gone, some perhaps taken to camps, about her village, no longer standing. And James told her about Georgia, about red clay and pecan trees, about his mother's biscuits, about how he'd once sung in a church choir before the army took his Sundays away. She laughed softly. Not because it was funny, but because the sound of a life outside this war seemed like something from a dream. Then she touched her heart and said a word he did not know. He tilted his head. She repeated it slowly. "Yubikiri." She held up her pinky. He stared, confused. She smiled gently and wrapped her pinky with his. "A promise," she said. Japanese. Child's promise. He nodded slowly, then whispered, "I swear." Their fingers remained linked for a moment. In the dark, that was more binding than any treaty signed in light. But above, footsteps stirred. Voices. "Down here, this one's open." A flare of panic. James turned to her, eyes urgent, voice low. "You have to hide." She understood at once. She pulled back into the shadows, behind the stones, behind the body of the cave. James stood, raised his hands as the light swept toward him. 3 soldiers entered, weapons lowered. "Private said he saw movement," one said. James shook his head. "Just rats. I've cleared this tunnel before. Nothing here." They searched, briefly, carelessly, then turned. As they left, one looked back. "You always hang out in holes, Mitchell?" James didn't answer. When they were gone, Shizuko emerged, trembling. He held her hand. And in that moment, both of them understood. This was the last time. He would not come again. The net was closing, patrols increasing, suspicion rising. But he had done what the war had tried to stop. He had found someone, not an enemy, a name, a soul. And he had remembered her, even when the world demanded he forget. James did not return to the cave again, not because he didn't want to, but because war has a way of surrounding what is sacred with steel. The southern sector was sealed the next morning. High Command had declared the ridges cleared and posted guards at known cave systems. Any stragglers found after that would be treated as threats. No questions, no mercy. James watched silently as white soldiers from a nearby platoon detonated the entrance to a smaller tunnel not far from hers. Just in case. Just to be sure. Limestone and silence. Crushed in a heartbeat. And all the while, his mind stayed beneath the earth. He didn't know if she had moved, if she had found another passage, if she was still alive. But he felt her, in the slowness of his step, in the ache in his hands as he rolled field wire, in the way he now watched every civilian face that passed, searching for her shape, her walk, her quietness. But she never appeared. Some nights, in the quiet after chow, he would take out the folded piece of cloth, not the dog tag, not the ration tin, but the handkerchief he'd given her. She had pressed it back into his hand the last night, just before he'd left, and in the corner of it, written in soft charcoal strokes, her name, Shizuko. No rank, no address, just her. It was the only thing he had left of her, and it was everything. Weeks passed. Okinawa fell quiet. The last Japanese general committed suicide in a cave near Mabuni. The island was declared secure, but nothing felt secure. Not the faces of the liberated civilians, staring blankly at the barbed wire around their new camps. Not the eyes of American soldiers, many of whom had begun to drink hard and speak softly, afraid of what the next invasion, the Japanese mainland, would cost. James was transferred north, then west. He laid cable, hauled crates, spoke little, but he never told anyone, not a soul. Because how could he explain it, that beneath all the hate, there had been a name? That under all the orders, there had been a whisper. That in the deepest dark, the enemy had given him something sacred, a reason to stay human. In August, the bombs fell. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The war shattered like glass, and from its edges rose fire. Light, smoke that did not stop for weeks, and surrender, unconditional. Men cheered. Women wept, flags waved, but James did not celebrate. He was not bitter. He was not proud. He was only quiet. Because for him, the war had not ended on a battleship deck in Tokyo Bay. It had ended in a cave, with a song, with a teacher who wrapped her pinky around his and taught him that even children in Japan made promises, and she had kept hers. Now he had to keep his. When the repatriation orders came down, James filed a request to be stationed on Okinawa for recovery duty. He said nothing more, just paperwork, just ink. 3 weeks later, the request was approved. By then, the island had changed again. American engineers were building roads through flattened villages. Airfields spread like scars. Japanese civilians were being gathered, processed, relocated. Most had no homes to return to. James was given a jeep and a field notebook. His job, identify abandoned shelters and mark them for clearance. But he had another map, one etched in memory. And one morning, long after the war had officially ended, he found the cave again. Overgrown now, choked with debris, he climbed down slowly, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. The deeper he went, the more he feared what silence might mean this time. He passed the wall where they had played the tapping game. Then, a sound, barely audible. Breath, then movement. He turned, and the beam found her. Thinner, dirt-streaked, but unmistakable. Shizuko. She did not flinch. She simply raised her hand, palm out. And in that hand, his dog tag. She hadn't run. She hadn't forgotten. She had waited. James dropped to one knee, not in shock, not in prayer, in gratitude. He didn't speak. He just reached for her hand and held it. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied, and in that soft yellow glow, the war finally ended. Not with a treaty, but with a woman who had kept a name alive in the dark. What cannot be buried is memory. What cannot be killed is trust, and what cannot be forgotten is love. But love, in the world left behind by war, had no uniform, no flag, no language. It lived, instead, in the quietest gestures. A hand held too long, a blanket shared without asking, a silence filled not with fear, but with breath. James helped her out of the cave slowly, shielding her eyes as the sunlight pierced the opening. She squinted, raising one trembling hand to block it. Her first time seeing the sky in nearly 3 months. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Some things, after surviving that much silence, are better honored without words. Her legs buckled once, halfway up the slope. James caught her, held her steady. She leaned into him, not out of weakness, but trust. And so, they emerged together. No guards, no patrols. The war, officially, was over. The island was quiet, and somewhere beyond the sea, men in suits were drawing new borders, writing new policies, deciding how the world would remember what had just happened. But James and Shizuko weren't thinking about maps or generals. They were thinking about breakfast. She hadn't eaten anything warm in weeks. Back at the American field station, he didn't take her through the front gate. That would mean paperwork, interrogation, questions. Instead, he led her behind the old chapel tent, where the chaplain kept a kettle warm and didn't ask questions he didn't want real answers to. Chaplain Gaines was an old man from Louisiana, black, quiet. His hands always moved slow, like he knew the world could break if you pushed too fast. When he saw James leading a barefoot Japanese woman wrapped in a GI blanket, he didn't flinch. He just said, "There's rice and broth," and he poured 2 bowls. They sat beneath a crooked fig tree, its branches black against the gray morning sky. Shizuko sipped slowly, then ate, then finally looked up and smiled. Not a wide smile, just the kind that grows from the center, like warmth rising in a stove that hasn't been lit in months. Gaines watched them for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Some things don't belong in reports." James met his gaze. "She saved me, Chaplain." Gaines didn't ask for details, just refilled her bowl. That afternoon, James brought her to the Red Cross tent. They had begun registering civilian survivors for medical care. Most were old men or young mothers with infants, all thin as prayer flags, all hollow-eyed. Shizuko stood in line like the others, head bowed, silent. When it was her turn, the young nurse asked, "Name?" She hesitated, looked at James. He nodded gently. She spoke clearly. "Shizuko." The nurse scribbled it phonetically, then paused. "Relation to the soldier?" Before James could answer, Shizuko lifted her hand, linked her pinky finger with his. The nurse blinked, confused. James answered, "She's a promise." The nurse frowned, not understanding. But she wrote it down anyway. Status, civilian. Affiliation, repatriation hold. Note, accompanied by U.S. personnel. Over the next weeks, James found quiet ways to keep her safe. She slept near the Red Cross compound in a borrowed cot. He brought her simple things. Clean socks, a soft bar of soap, a pencil. She taught him 3 words of Japanese each night. He taught her how to whistle, badly, at first, then better. One evening, he caught her humming "Jesus Loves Me" again, under her breath, folding her shirt with military precision. "Didn't think you remembered that one," he said. She replied without looking up. It remembered me. There were no parades for what they shared, no medals for not giving in to hate. But in the spaces between duty and dusk, something rare grew between them. Something the world wasn't ready to name. Not yet, because there is no word in any army for 2 people who refuse to see each other as enemy. No form to fill out for the trust passed between hands in the dark. One morning, James received a letter. His unit was rotating home. Discharge papers. Transport to California in 12 days. When he told her, Shizuko didn't cry. She simply nodded, then disappeared for a while. He found her that evening beside the old fig tree, seated with her knees tucked to her chest, eyes on the ocean. In her lap, a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him. Inside was a drawing, done in charcoal on Red Cross stationery. 2 hands linked by pinkies. Above them, the words she had learned to say, written in her shaky English. "Promise." He looked at her. "You'll be all right?" She nodded. "I can wait, if you don't forget me." He smiled. "That's not something I know how to do." She tapped his chest gently over his heart. "Then you will come back when you're ready." And he whispered, "Yubikiri." They did not kiss. There was no farewell embrace. Only two hands meeting once more, pinky to pinky, like a bridge across oceans, a ceremony no war could erase. The troop ship pulled out of Naha Harbor under a gray morning sky, its long silhouette splitting the Pacific like a blade dulled by time. On the deck, Sergeant James Mitchell stood near the railing, one hand in his coat pocket, fingers pressed against the folded drawing she had given him. He did not wave. Shizuko wasn't there to see it, but in his mind, she was still by the fig tree, the ocean breeze lifting strands of her hair as she looked east, toward the land that had once called him enemy, and which he now left behind, carrying part of her with him. America was not the same place he'd left. The train that rolled him through the southern fields back to Georgia, past old towns that still flinched when a black man walked alone at night. There were no parades, no banners, just silence, cotton fields, and the long road back to what he used to call home. But James wasn't the same either. He returned not as a conqueror nor a hero, but as a keeper of something fragile, a memory that could not be told in full. Not to his family, not to his neighbors, not even, at first, to himself. Because how do you explain to a world still split by lines and skin and flags that the person who saved your soul was the one you were sent to fear? He took work with the telephone company, married briefly. It didn't last. Not because she was unkind, but because he'd already given his name to someone else, years before, beneath the earth of another country. At night, when the wind shifted through the Georgia pines, he sometimes thought he could hear her voice again, soft, teaching him a word, or singing the melody of a song that neither of them ever fully understood. He kept the dog tag she'd held, carried the drawing with him in a small tin box, and on the back of it, with careful pen, he'd written one line: "She remembered me in the dark. I will remember her in the light." Years passed, then decades. America changed. Slowly, loudly. The world moved on from Okinawa, turned its eyes to Korea, to Vietnam, to newer battles with newer names. But James never forgot the one he left behind. In 1969, he returned. No orders this time. No uniform. Just a man in a brown coat, stepping off a plane onto Okinawan soil during the twilight of U.S. occupation. The air smelled the same, of salt, pine, and distant smoke. The fig tree was gone. The chapel tent was gone. The camp had long since been dismantled, paved over by roads and factories. But the land still remembered, and so did she. He found her at a small village school near Uraso, teaching children how to read. She didn't see him at first. He stood by the door, uncertain, holding his breath like a boy again. Then she turned, and time folded like paper. She was older, hair streaked with gray. But the smile, the small, quiet smile, was exactly the same. She said nothing, neither did he. But she reached for his hand, and once more, their pinkies linked. And that was all that mattered. Oh, they did not marry. Some stories do not follow the world's laws. They simply unfold, leaf by leaf, in the quiet soil of memory and return. James stayed for a season, then two. He taught local boys how to repair radios. She taught him the words for wind, for rice, for forgiveness. In the evenings, they sat beneath a different tree, a pine this time, and watched the children run in circles, shouting both English and Japanese in a chaos of laughter. One day a boy asked, "Oji-san, what were you in the war?" James paused, smiled, then answered carefully, "I was someone who learned how to listen." "And you?" the boy asked Shizuko. She thought for a moment, then said, "I was someone who waited." The boy frowned. "That's not soldier work." Shizuko looked toward the sky, No, she said gently. It's something older. In 1983, James passed away quietly in his sleep. A simple room in Okinawa. No medals on the wall. Just a folded cloth, a charcoal drawing, and a woman's name beside his in a shared drawer. At the funeral, Shizuko placed a small white ribbon on his chest. The same one her mother had tied to her wrist before the caves fell. When asked if he had any surviving family, she nodded once and said, "Yes, I do." And in the cemetery where Americans and Japanese alike were buried, side by side, a stone was placed with no rank and no unit, just two names, James Mitchell Shizuko, and beneath them, carved in both English and Japanese, a promise kept in darkness becomes the light. Because in a world rebuilt from fire and memory, there must be places with no word for enemy, only names, only hands, only songs.